Hello, everyone. Welcome to another live session at the Reactors. My name is Rav, and I'm the program manager at Reactor London. And before we get into the session, please take a moment to read our code of conduct. We're all here to learn, so please be respectful, please be kind, ask a lot of good questions. We're back with another episode of A Beginner's Guide to AI, and today is episode 4. I believe this is the last episode of the series, and it's going to be talking all about Azure OpenAI services. So with that, I am going to add Johan to the stage, and off you go, Johan. All the best.
Thank you very much. Thanks, Rav. And good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. Of course, these are global events, so we don't really have control over this, but I hope that you had a great week so far, and I hope that we can round up your week with a nice little session around Azure OpenAI Services. So Azure OpenAI Services is a relatively new service. I think it's been going now for about 8-9 months, or maybe even a little bit less. And as per usual, I'd like to just kind of point you towards a couple of things here. I believe that Rav will put these in the comments in a minute, but I've got 2 links for you at this point. The one link is going to essentially take you out to, oopsie, not sure why it's not linking yet. There we go. So the one link is to an actual Microsoft Learn, course that you can go and take, where you'll see that we will talk about an introduction to Azure OpenAI services, get started with these services, build some NLP solutions, and apply prompt engineering. So you can go through all this material at your own pace, and you can see that there's, talking about the REST API, this SDK, etc. So all of this information is available for you to do. We are probably at some point in time going to create going to integrate this, I believe, into our Azure developer course. I think it's our Azure AI developer course, which is, I think, the AI 102 certification. It'll be part of that eventually, but this learning path is something that you can go and work through at your own time. It's well worth doing that. It's kind of how we all prepare for these things, I guess, is going through this material. And then the second thing there, and I'm going to do a couple of demos from this today. You'll see that I've also put a link in there that will essentially link you out to the hands-on labs, right? We've got some hands-on labs with regards to this, and these hands-on labs are essentially going to take you through provisioning some of the services, and then individual applications that outline how to build a little C# or a kind of any type of application. I think you can choose between C# and you can also use I think let me just make sure about this. Yeah, got the option of using C# and Python for most of these labs. So some very entry-level labs that will essentially see you working through some of the examples and building little applications that essentially integrate into these OpenAI services. But enough about that. Again, my name is Jan Meiberg, and welcome to our session. Today's agenda, we're going to just talk broadly what Azure OpenAI services are. We'll chat a little bit about the different models. We're not going to get too deep into these different models. I've got a couple of demos I want to give to you. We will touch on some of the key concepts around OpenAI services, some of the constraints, possibly how the costing and the licensing works around that. And then we're gonna summarize everything by getting going. And this is going to be kind of like a 0 to hero walkthrough, kind of how to provision these services, and then from there how to publish one of these models and start leveraging these models. So I'll see if I can roll everything into a nice demo towards the end there. So let's get cracking here. The first thing is, what is Azure OpenAI, right? You might have heard of OpenAI. OpenAI is an initiative that's kind of behind this ChatGPT phenomenon that's hit the world about just less than a year ago. And it's essentially Azure components that give you a REST API and access to OpenAI's powerful language models, including GPT-4, GPT 3.5, embeddings, and a couple of additional models. You can see there on the right-hand side, we've got DALL-E, we've got Whisper, and I think those two are actually still in preview. But I can also demo some of you. I cannot demo Whisper for you yet, but I can demo at least DALL-E for you if you want to see some of that. Now, these models are not just the models themselves. We've got a whole bunch of services that surround them, and you can even fine-tune these models if you wanted to, right? Kind of bring your own data and fine-tune these models to be a little bit more reactive to how you want them to react, right? So you can kind of tweak what these models are, what these models and APIs are going to be delivering to your end users if you were building applications in this space. For example, if you were building something in the legal fraternity, maybe you're building an application that does, that deals with legal information, and you don't want the model to be providing any information around medical sort of questionnaires and things like that, right? You can tune these models to essentially hone in on what exactly you want them to deliver. There's currently a couple of models. We've got GPT-4. I mentioned them already. We've got the embeddings series. There's Whisper that's on its way out, which is a relatively new one. I think it's still in preview. That's essentially going to give you, the ability to, from spoken text, generate, written text. And you can request access via this link. I apologize. I am pretty sure I have this link here somewhere. Give me 1 second. Yes. It is in fact this link over here. Apologies for that. There we go. So we're on the fly there. So you can, if you click on this link here, it's going to take you through to a Microsoft customer voice page where you will essentially be able to request access to Azure OpenAI services. This service will not be available by default to your subscriptions. You essentially have to complete this form and explain to Microsoft how you'll need it, how many subscriptions you want to have access to the capability, and give us your company name, details, and a whole bunch of information around this. And once this has been approved, then Microsoft will enable this capability in your Azure environment, right? And that subscription will be able to create those Azure OpenAI services, and I'll demonstrate that for you in a bit. So the other question you might have is, where does this Azure OpenAI fit into Microsoft's AI stack, if you like? And of course, right at the bottom layer here, we've got the machine learning component where you can build your own models. Really, you can even use Azure Machine Learning to tweak and customize and fine tune the OpenAI services if you're keen on doing that. But just above the machine learning layer, we've got our customizable AI models, our cognitive services, which is now, I think, been renamed to Azure AI Services and not cognitive services, which includes vision, speech, language, decision, and then inherently now as well, the Azure OpenAI services. On top of that, we've got the scenario-based services, the form recognizer, almost implementations, if you like, of some of those types of capabilities, vision, speech, language type capabilities. And then we've got the application platform and AI builder components, where essentially you can leverage some of these capabilities using low or no code type scenarios. Think of things like Power Automate, Power Apps, Power Virtual Agents, Power BI, and then at the very top layer, more on the business side, as you can see on the right-hand side there, we're talking about our applications that leverage most of these capabilities. Microsoft and Dynamics 365, for example, that leverage some of these capabilities through, Copilot programs and other integration into our AI stack. Now, I did mention a couple of these models. And you'll notice that I've just sort of put a couple of them on here. This is straight from our Learn portal, so you can get more information about these over there. You'll see that starting with GPT-4, essentially just an improvement in terms of speed and performance on GPT-3.5. Whereas GPT-3.5, the original sort of, the original that we model that we all kind of mostly got to know, that it gives you like great sort of language understanding and natural language and code generation capabilities. There's also embeddings where we can essentially form vectors based on the text to check for similarity in words. And this is inherently something that's built into these models under the covers as well. Because when I get the model to generate text, I can specify how close do I want the model's answer to be to a similar answer that it gave earlier on. And I've got some control over that, right? It's called a temperature. I can set the temperature to say that if I ask you the same question twice, how close is the second answer going to be to that, right? So based on what it's answered, it will realize that through some internal embeddings that it's got, it's answered it in this context like this already, so I'll give you a different answer and you've got control over that. And then for DALL-E, typically, we're talking about the ability for these, for this model to generate images based on text input. And then I mentioned Whisper already, that's going to essentially translate and transcribe, speech to text. And I'll demonstrate some of these in a bit as well. I do, however, want to just pause for a minute and just chat about the key concepts. It's important that you kind of get your head around some of these things. And again, I'll show this to you in a minute. But first of all, if you've created your service inside of Azure, it's essentially going to give you access to the OpenAI Studio, and in the Azure OpenAI Studio, you'll then be able to do a deployment. Once you've done a deployment, taking one of these models and deploying one of these models, it's essentially going to give you an endpoint. And there's, for example, there's a completion endpoint where you can send a text and it's got the ability to send back some text from that. Think, for example, of that item I've got beneath that, where you can see here that I'm prompting it, count to 5 in a for loop, and then it's doing a completion around that where it's coming back with a with a for statement range, 1 to 6 and print I, whatever the case might be. And I'll demonstrate some of this for you as well. Before we talk about tokens, I think it's important that we first touch on the cost model here, right? Because the cost is different for each of these models. It's just going to take a second to pop open here. If I scroll down here, you will see that there's the language models for all these different models. It's got some context. It's got, from a prompt or from a completion perspective, it's got some pricing, and you'll see that this is per 1,000 tokens, right? And you'll see the word tokens appear here quite a bit. So the costing model centers around tokens, and tokens is essentially the service that breaks down text into smaller pieces, right? So you'll see there's a good example there where the word hamburger might be broken down into 3 tokens, ham, bur, and ger, and that essentially will be 3 tokens. So we're really kind of centering the cost model around the number of tokens that's been generated, and that essentially is how we work out the cost. Something like a pair, for example, might be a single token, just as an example. So our costing model varies per each of these models that are outlined, and per each of the different types of services that we've got available. And then I also mentioned these models. Each model provides different capabilities. Some of these models, for example, if you look at the GPT-4 versus GPT-3.5 model, is just the next iteration and the next version of that model, right? So it provides possibly some additional capabilities, but probably just things like capability and performance type improvements. and possibly a bigger corpus of information that it's kind of built its model on, right? So each of these models are completely different. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to pause here a bit just on the how to get going slide, and then I'm going to see if I can demonstrate most of these through to you. First of all, you need to, as I mentioned, you need to request access for these services in the portal. This will be linked up with a subscription, and once you've got it enabled, you can go and provision the service in a subscription. If I go to my if I just do a search for Azure OpenAI Services, and I scroll down here, you will see that there's, there's typically the Microsoft Learning component, and you can see that there's what is Azure OpenAI Services. It's got a bunch of these models. It's got a couple of these principles, more or less what I've got in some of my slides as well. But we've got a really good, layout here in terms of documenting these features, and you can see from there that I can go and drill down, for example, on each of these different models. There's ChatGPT 4. GPT 3.5, there's DALL-E, for example, there's the Whisper model. And of course, there's also some quick starts, right? So you can see from a completions perspective, there's a whole bunch of examples that you can go and leverage around this. So again, my point is here is, don't get bogged down with the learn material that we've got available in this. You should also look at the other learn.microsoft.com material. That's essentially our documentation around this. There's some really good content. There's some examples. There's some sample apps that you can provision around this. So how do I go and do this? So first of all, you request access. Once you've got access, you need to then essentially provision the service. So what I've already provisioned the service here, but you'll notice that if I click on Azure OpenAI, there's already a service, and I'll use that service, but I'm going to create one quickly. Hit the create button here, and I'm going to select that subscription that has been enabled. I'm going to go for OpenAI there. I'll select the East US region, and I'm going to say that this is the Reactor OpenAI service, and then it's prompting me for a pricing tier, and you'll see that there's a standard tier in there right now. And of course, this full pricing details is going to link out to the pricing that I showed you earlier on, right? This pricing over here. I'm going to hit the next button. It's got some networking capabilities, and essentially what we are saying here is possibly we don't want to be able to access this OpenAI interface and API through the internet. Possibly we want it to be accessible from an Azure virtual network. So maybe I've got a web server that's running on a virtual network in Azure, and I don't need to expose this OpenAI interface to the internet, right? So then I can essentially go and select one or more virtual networks, and I can place it on a subnet, and it implies that I can access this only from that subnet and not from the internet, from the cloud. And I'm actually not going to provision this. Once I've provisioned this, it's essentially going to look like this. And before I carry on here, you'll see that our Azure OpenAI Services is just part of our Azure AI Services, right? Our other AI services. We spoke about this in last week's session: cognitive search, computer vision, face API, etc. This is essentially the API that I just created, or the Azure Open API service that I created. I did this early on, and you'll see that if I click on endpoints, it's going to prompt me for my, for the different endpoints. There you can see there's my language API endpoint, there's my DALL-E endpoint, there's even a Whisper API endpoint that I can essentially use. So this is accessible to my keys and endpoint scenario. And if I wanted to show these keys, I can then see there's the region, there's the two different keys that I've got, and I can essentially roll these keys if they were compromised, or if our governance requires us to roll these keys just periodically. So once I've created the service, you'll see that we've essentially now rolled this model capability into the Azure OpenAI Studio. But if I click on my overview here, then you will see that there's a link there to the OpenAI Studio. The OpenAI Studio is essentially, and you can see that I've mentioned this here, you'll then, once you provision the service, you can then go and deploy a model using the OpenAI Studio component. If I crack this open, it's going to take me to the OpenAI Studio, which is a dedicated portal for each of the services that you create. So this service that I created called J Always On, it's got its own studio, and if I created another one, it'll also have its own studio. Let's do that later on. So you'll see that there's a playground here, and the playground allows me to test some of these models that we've got available. But before I do that, I first have to deploy a model, right? You can see that there's some models that I've got available. In this specific implementation, I don't have GPT-4. It was not available at the time. I think you also have to request GPT-4 separately, from what I remember, and you will see that it specifies what the status is for some of these. Right. So I can actually go and create a deployment. And by creating a deployment, it's going to make that endpoint available for me. So there you can see I can go and say, well, I want to use GPT Turbo 16K, for example, specify the model version I want to be using, and then give it a deployment name. Once I've given it a name, it's essentially, shows me, some of the metadata and attributes of that specific deployment. So there's a couple of deployments that I've already created. You can see it shows me some of that capacity there, and then when I'm done deploying the model, I can actually start testing the model, right? And this OpenAI Studio has got a great interface for doing this, right? So first of all, you'll notice that we've got a chat environment here, and I can actually go and specify how the chat is going to be acting. So if I want to use, for example, an IRS tax chatbot, that sort of style of texting, then I can go and select this. If I want to use maybe an Xbox customer support agent, a marketing writing assistant, Shakespeare for that matter, then it's essentially going to answer me with that sort of, in that context. I can also add some additional examples if I wanted to. So here you'll notice I'm using the GPT-3.5 Turbo right now, and in here I can say, hey, what are you? And you'll notice it's going to pop back and it's going, hey, I'm an AI assistant designed to help you find information, answer your questions. How can I assist you today? Right. So it's giving me kind of like a little framework and a portal here that I can actually test and play around with this this API. So I can go and ask it a bunch of questions here. I can even show some of the raw JSON format data. This is essentially the information that you might be programmatically sending through to the endpoint and then receiving the code behind that. And you can see that we've even got a view code in there, right, where I can use something like Python. I can go for something like C#, and it'll churn out some of the C# code for me. So we've really gone a long way to assist you in getting going as soon as possible, creating all that scaffolding for you so that you don't have to go and start from scratch. And once you've got the API, figure out how to get going from the word, from basically nothing. There's the endpoint you can use, and there's the key I can use. And of course, it's just a question of specifying the endpoint and the key, and I'm good to go. So you will also see that we've got a bunch of parameters here. And of course, these parameters are accessible via the SDK and via the API. So some of these parameters I might want to just leave as the default. Some of these parameters I might want to specify when I'm calling the service, in that context. And you can see there's things like, for example, the max response, right? And we've got proper descriptions here for these. You'll see there, the amount of text I'm going to be getting back, all based on tokens. So it'll give you an idea of, how much text is going to get generated by each of these requests. And then there's also things like temperature, the uniqueness of the result that's coming back. If I'm, for example, asking the same question twice, just as an example, stop sequences. What do I need to do to get the AI interface to stop generating results? And then you can also see that there's things like frequency penalties, etc. There's a bunch of configuration and parameters that will essentially assist you in governing and managing, this specific API. So that's essentially my deployment. I can also specify which deployment I want to be using, and I can also go and specify how many passed messages I want to show in this context. There you can see. So that's essentially the chat playground. But we've also got this completions playground, and you'll notice from the completions playground that I've got essentially the option to say, the chicken crossed the road too, and I can generate the completion based on that. And you'll see it says to get to the other side is an example of an anti-joke. Anti-jokes are often absurd and lack punchlines, and you can see that I can actually go and say, well, let's rather go with something like I might regret this one. And let's see what it says. And hello, 2319. Can you believe it? My work here is done. I'm taking the weekend off. It was a hard-fought game. Now, again, the point here is that it's randomizing this information, as you can well imagine. But again, it's just a little playground where you can look at the different deployments that we've got available. You can even go and load some examples, right? Summarize an article, for example, right? And I can go and generate that, and it will do that completion for me. From a DALL-E perspective, you will see that I can go and generate these images as well. I've got an example of that from a little command line application that I'll show to you in a minute as well. But you can see here that I can go and specify something like I want an image of a fish in a fishbowl with a disco theme. Now, I haven't put too much thought into this, as you can probably see from this, but it's busy generating the image based on that input that I've got. And there you can see there's my fish. If I hit the generate button again, it's going to generate another one. Right. So if I go for a goldfish, for example, right, then it'll generate another one for me, right? And of course, you can see that I've got some the options to download this, and this is essentially also what it's going to do if I'm writing a little application. So I'll show you a little command line application that I've got running locally a bit later on, where I'm integrating into this API and service, and I'm generating some images, and it returns with a URL that I can use to download the image if I want that image. And then I've got some control over this. You can see that there's the code that I might actually use to actually make a call like this, right, and send this information through to that endpoint API. So I've covered the playground, I think, pretty comprehensively. Possibly the only thing I do want to show you, still on the playground side of things, is the ability for me to say I want to deploy this to a new web application, right? So I can go and say, well, now we've got the model up and running, but we don't want to give folks access to the playground to be able to go and test and look at some of these features and capabilities. So why can't we just give something, build something that we can give to our end users in our organization so that they can trial certain things and look at the information that gets returned. So I can say deploy to a new web application, and I can either update an existing web application or create a brand new one. This is essentially an Azure App Service with an App Service plan that's going to be running inside of Azure. And you can see I can give it a name, specify my subscription, specify the location, and even specify the pricing plan, right? There's even a free pricing plan, but of course that's not going to be performing as well as you might want. You will also see that we've got an option here that says enable chat history in the web app. Chat history is essentially going to get stored in a Cosmos DB account that will be created in that same resource group. So you want to be mindful of this. If you don't need the chat history, obviously this is going to be a little bit cheaper, right? Because it's not going to provision all those services and store all that data. But I can store the history of the chat history of the web app, and it'll go and store this information in a Cosmos DB service, Cosmos DB account that'll get created in that same resource group. I've already done this, however, and you'll see that I've got this launch web app option. Let me just quickly take a step back here and go through my app services. You will see that there's my Reactor OpenAI application inside of Azure. You know, most of the capabilities that we've got available through our app services is in here. You can see that there's some configuration options, and you will notice from a configuration perspective that it's set up some of these, some of these options. There's the Cosmos DB account, the Cosmos DB database name, for example, OpenAI embedding key. All of this information sits in this app service. So just from a compliance perspective, you might want to reroute some of these to point to something like a key vault, for example, so the data doesn't sit in raw format in your app services, right? Because essentially it's sitting there as environmental variables, and that might be going against your policy and your compliance requirements. So I can essentially click on the URL here, and you'll see that it's going to give me a little sort of simplified, application. And in fact, I do want to show you quickly that I crack it open in private browser window, that it is going to prompt me to sign in first. So the reason it didn't prompt me for that is I actually signed in earlier, and I have to then give it access to my, to my profile information, etc. So I have to approve this, right? If I'm showing some of that information, I don't think I'm going to sign in through that. But there you can see this is a very standard sort of interface. Where is Azure stored in the, or where you can see there, London, Cardiff, Durham, Glasgow, kind of all these locations. Very sort of simple interface. Can you generate images? Do not have the capability to generate images. So it's not going to generate those DALL-E images I showed you early on. I just wanted to test that and see what it says around that. But it does, give you the ability to do this. Can you generate code, for example, right? And it should be quite happy to generate code. Right, so can you show me a code snippet of what a C# program might look like that talks to. Right, so let's get some code going. It's very simple. You've all probably seen this available, but it's now running against my OpenAI service and API endpoints that's sitting inside of Azure. All right, so this is essentially, the process that you'll take. You'll first request access to the service in your subscription, provision the service. Once you've provisioned the service, you'll deploy a model. Once you've deployed the model, you can test that model in the OpenAI Studio using the chat using the DALL-E capabilities. I believe DALL-E currently is only available in East US, but that might have changed in the last week or so. And then, of course, towards the end of that, you want to build your application, right? So what I've got here is I do actually have an application. I've got a little C# application, just a stock standard program. I've got my app settings, and this is part of what you'll be doing if you do those labs that I shared in the link with you early on. And you'll see from this perspective, I've got my OpenAI endpoint. I've got my OpenAI key here, and I'm specifying the model name. And from this perspective, if I go back to my program here, you can see there that it's essentially spinning up this connection. And then from there, it is, it is going to be, it's going to be summarizing this information in this text. So let's find something a little bit, more sort of suited towards this. The audience profile for this course. There we go. That looks like a good one. I'm going to paste that. And I'm just going to do a .NET run here. You'll see there that, it's saying the audience for this course includes software developers, and it's got a little summary that it's churned out. So it's sent this information off, even broken it down if it's too long, send this information off to the API endpoint. The API endpoint returns with a short summary of this information, right? So very, very simple example of what you might be doing. I've got another couple of examples. I want to quickly just work through most of these examples, if it's all the same to you. I've got about 4 demos that I want to do. All right, so here, I'm going to do a .NET run. And what we're going to be doing here is I've got this, this is essentially going to be some prompt engineering. And you'll see that it's prompting me, no pun intended. It's prompting me for either a basic prompt, a prompt with email formatting and a basic system message. And if I look at my email format here, this is a file where I've basically specified the system message. You're an AI assistant helping to write emails, and the prompt is write a promotional email for a new wildlife rescue, and then there's essentially some additional information around that. Rescue name is Contoso. It specializes in rhinos, for example. Let's do something really silly. Let's go for ants. All right. I'm going to save that, and I'm just going to go with option number 2 there. And you'll see there you're an AI assistant helping to write mails, and you can see there that, despite their small size, ants play a very vital role. It's completely taken that ants section that I've changed in that text into consideration for the entire message. And I mean, you have to sort of, give it kudos for that. It might take you, sort of 15, 20 minutes to churn out an email like this. And very similar for the rest thing, right? I can go and say, just give me a basic prompt, and the basic prompt will be based on write an intro for a wildlife rescue. And you can see that there's, an introduction for a wildlife rescue. So again, a couple of examples. These examples are predominantly from the link that I've shared with you. So let's go with number 4 here. There's some code generation options, right? And in here, I've got some functions. I'm just going to start this in an Explorer window and just navigate to there. There you can see there's my sample code, and there's my function. There's function.cs. There's my Python function, and then there's another project, for example. So in here I can do a .NET run command. All of these examples are available for you. If I say add comments to my function, it's going to take a look at that function, and it's essentially going to start, commenting, writing comments for the function. And you can see there This function takes two integers as inputs and returns the absolute square of their difference. Calculate the absolute difference, square the result, return the square result, and then returns that result. So just again, another example of how it's, as opposed to generating text, it can generate code, right? Or it can describe code and comment out your code if you want. Add comments to code, I mean to say. And then I've got one last option here. And it's the image generation option, where I'm using that DALL-E engine and DALL-E API that I spoke about. So if I do a .NET run here, and of course I've set up my endpoints, all of those things, together. And at this point in time, I can go for something like, show me the Microsoft logo if it was in black and white. Very simple example. There we go, and you can see that there's, it's generated that URL for me, and this is a really bad example, but you're getting the idea again, right? So I can go and run this again, and let's ask for a pink elephant in the bush, and it'll come back with that URL, and it's hopefully going to look slightly better than that Microsoft logo. You can see it's got a slight sort of pink sort of slant to it. Okay, so yeah, I'm hoping that and again, all these demos all the code demos at least that I've got is available for you via that link that we shared with you that takes you through to the hands-on labs. So you can go and work through those hands-on labs. You can get all these demos going if you wanted to. We're constantly adding some additional labs there. So our learn material is currently growing quite fast around this. And our hands-on labs also growing quite fast around this. So there's probably going to be some additional hands-on labs you can be doing, relatively soon. There's also another hands-on lab I saw in there that's essentially allowing you to bring your own data and to essentially fine-tune the model if you wanted to do that. So you can also work through that hands-on lab if you're keen on that. And that's pretty much that. Very quick lap around our OpenAI services. We've got, just in summary, we spoke about the Azure OpenAI service, what it is. We touched on a couple of these models. We looked at some of that configuration around it. And then we cracked open a couple of demos where hopefully you could see that, it's relatively simple to go from a 0 to hero type scenario where you've got nothing. And within a couple of minutes, you've got some source code that works against the APIs. And you've got that web application that we can provision inside of Azure that gives you a chat interface that you can start testing things and give to your end users to play around with. And that brings me to the end of this session. I've gone probably a little bit quick today, but let's see if there are any questions.
So we have one question from Cloud Therapist. Does Microsoft offer public data sets that I can use to train my own model using Azure OpenAI API services, or is it expected that customers bring their own data sets and use Azure OpenAI APIs on it?
Yeah, so Microsoft is training these models on as much data as we can. So it's kind of trained on huge amounts of data, and the API has already got those models behind the scenes, right? So if you want to tweak and fine-tune these models, it's expected that you bring your own data around that. Right? So we're going to try to feed as much as possible data into these models as we can. But if you want custom data, then you expect that you bring your own data around that. Yeah.
Okay, I think we just had one question. Maybe we'll just give it a few seconds.
Yeah. So ladies and gents, just from my side, again, look at those links that we shared with you. The links are if you want to learn more about this, these links are critical. You can go do the labs. You can go look at the self-paced learning material, and that will get you going really, really quickly. Within a week or so, you can be up and running and start building applications that leverage these services. Can I connect via Azure OpenAI API from an IoT device and feed it real-time images, videos for further teaching, decision making? Yes, there's API around that. So yeah, certainly you can do that. You can either use the portal, and I can probably show that to you quickly if it's all the same to you. Where is my portal? There's my playground. You can see there's data files, right, where I can actually go and add new data sets, right? I can even go for my content filters here and specify that I want certain information, hate speech, for example, explicit information to be filtered out, just as an example. But yeah, absolutely, you can bring your own data here, but it's also available via the API, so you can do that. And possibly you'll see that there's probably a sort of a walkthrough here that'll take you through how to fine tune the model with custom data that you're providing for it. So yeah, the answer is, in short, yes, it's available to do this through the API. It's really slow now, but you see what I'm getting at. Okay, well, if there you can see there's you can fine tune the model using the REST API, and you'll see that it actually talks you through how to do this, right? So this is essentially what you can do. So absolutely, that's possible. What are the benefits of using Azure OpenAPI compared to using OpenAPI directly? Is it safer? Well, I don't think it's about, is it safer, right? These models are essentially secured using very similar sort of endpoints and keys and scenarios like that. So it's not necessarily that it's safer, but it's more a question of if you were a Microsoft customer and you hosted your infrastructure inside of Azure, this is an extension of that now, right? In fact, if you are, and you've got control over that, if you are leveraging some of the other open API endpoints directly, it's most likely sitting in Azure in any way, right? Except now you've got a little bit more control over this, right? You can fine tune these models, for example, and you've just got, maybe from an RBAC perspective and from an internal governance perspective, you can define where you want the data to reside. I want it in the UK, for example. So think about this more from a compliance perspective and from an overall governance perspective as from a security perspective, if that answers that question. Right? If you were, for example, a large financial institution and 90% of your workloads are running in Azure, 10% are running on premises, then you might want to run these types of solutions out of Azure as well, right? Just to be on the same page. Yeah. Okay. So I hope that answered that question. Perfect. All right. So, ladies and gents, I think it doesn't look like there are any other questions here. To this end, you are more than welcome to go and scan that QR code. So from my side and from the Reactor side, thank you very much. It's been a pleasure spending this time with you today, talking about cool new technology that we've got available that's busy changing the world. So from my side, Rav, also just thank you for your input and help. And yeah, we will see you hopefully soon on another session. Hang on, there's another question. Is it best that I do my real-time decisions on edge devices based on rules from my Azure AI model, or send them back real-time decisions on it? Yeah, I'm not really 100% sure what you mean by that, right? We don't have the we don't have the this is not like our cognitive services where we've got the ability to do the processing on the edge yet. I believe it's only available inside of Azure. So you don't really have the option to call the API locally or on the edge where your IoT devices might be sitting, right? But we do have those options for our cognitive services. So if you just want to do things like language translation, those sort of things, then those sort of services can run as containers on even on your IoT edge scenarios, right? On premises, in your factories, for example. So it really just depends. And certain scenarios, like, let me give you an example of this, right? If I've got an IoT device that's counting the number of people that are walking through my door in my retail bank scenario, for example, right? There's no reason for that processing to be happening on premises. You can very easily stream that information into the cloud and make decisions in the cloud, and even analyze this information 2 or 3 days later on. But if I'm busy building one of these EV charging stations, and something happens on the EV charging station that might get the EV charging station to blow up, for that matter, you don't first want to be sending a request to the cloud and then coming back and saying, whoa, switch this thing off before it blows up, right? So it's not really anything to do with AI specifically. You might use AI in the decision making, but yeah, you need to approach this in a horses for courses type scenario. Certain questions should be answered on premises as quickly as possible. Certain questions can be answered in the cloud 2 or 3 days later on when you do your analysis. So it just depends what your type of scenario is around your IoT devices, for that matter. I hope that answers the question. With Microsoft, always recommend using the Azure OpenAI. I'm not really sure what you mean by that, to be brutally honest. If you say, would we always recommend using the Azure OpenAPI as opposed to what, for example, right? As opposed to using our cognitive services, possibly. It's not really the same thing, or even though there might be a bit of an overlap. If you take 2 or 3 of our cognitive services and kind of daisy chain them together, you might get a very similar type of thing. Or is there any occasion where you would recommend using OpenAI API directly? Look, I work for Microsoft, so for me, it will be, we promote the service inside of Azure. So if you have requirements that you want to run it outside of Azure, I cannot really think of any scenarios around that, right? So I'm not really sure what the answer is for that. Depends on your scenario. It depends on where you've got access to, I guess. Maybe from a corporate perspective, you're not allowed to access something inside of Azure, right? And in those instances, you might have to use that. All right. So, gosh, I hope that answered all the questions. Any further comments here, ladies and gents? Any further questions? All right. Well, thank you very much for the questions. I really appreciate that. It's great to see that there's some folks kind of, so as keen on these things as I am. But from my side, thank you very much.